So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Centralization, procurement data, right? GSA. Where are we at with that, Emily? What's going on? I mean, I was at a veterans conference and they literally said to the veterans and this IT, I think it was ITAC, was their buying for IT, and they said, well, what's happening with GSA? They go, we don't know. So that's kind of like
the 25 conference you were at, or was it a different one?
Yes, okay. That's 25.
One of my colleagues was down there also, and actually was speaking at the conference.
Okay.
So again, the president issued an executive order saying we're going to consolidate common, anything under category management basically should be consolidated at GSA. And the way we're going to do that is first, agencies, you come and tell us what it is you can consolidate. GSA, then you take a look at this, you come back with a plan, you submit it to OMB. OMB then comes back and tells you, okay, go and forth and implement. So we made it through that first thing where the agencies, I think, submitted data and gave information to GSA. I think GSA took a look at it and said, all right, we're not sure that we want every common thing. We don't want to we're not going to take over for construction contracting for Army Corps of Engineers. That's not our, Public Building Service does some construction, but they're not trying to take the place of the Corps of Engineers. I don't think that they're trying to go in and take medical supplies away from VA, for example.
Right.
But they did come out with a pretty aggressive, we think that there should be one, especially when it comes to IT, commercial IT, that we want one solution. Sorry, my dog just got back from their walk, so they're coming in to say hello.
Okay.
So GSA then it was developing its plan on how it was going to implement this. And as part of that, we started seeing some agencies sending their contracting over to GSA, OPM, SBA, to a certain extent, Department of Education, HUD sent some work over. We started seeing those go over to GSA. And then we had some court cases about reorganization, and not specifically about GSA or not about about contracting consolidation, but more about government reorganization as a whole. And the courts came out and they said, put in place an injunction on any further reorganizations until they'd address these questions. So now the question becomes, okay, where do we go from there? Because GSA is sitting there trying to get a reorganization in place so that they can handle all the work that they're being told that they're supposed to handle. And the agencies have been making plans to sort of offload a lot of this work to GSA, but they're frozen right now. So we're waiting, and no one's going to come out and announce, here's what the new plan looks like, until they're actually ready to implement it. Because if you announce it and then don't do anything, you've just set up basically a straw man for everyone to punch. So they've got to come out and figure out when are you going to actually be able to pull the trigger on this? And so I think GSA has been using the time to do additional planning, at least that's what it appears, and come up and look at their systems and try and figure out how they're going to share data across agencies. How are requirements going to travel between two agencies? How is information going to go into an agency's ERP system? How are payments going to be made? All sorts of just the mundane intricacies of contracting. How do you make money go back and forth? And how do you make sure that you've got the right contract management in place, even post award? How are you administering things? So they haven't been able to do all of that. They've been planning on it. What they have done, though, is come out and announce they have what they're calling a OneGov strategy. And they've been doing a lot of reviews of a lot of contractors. So they've been looking at the value-added resellers, the mission integrators, the systems integrators, and trying to get data from them, trying to see what they can do to enter into direct contracts with the OEMs, and what they can do to drive down prices on consulting companies, systems integrators, those who are providing more professional services on a broad scope across government. And it remains to be seen how that's going to play out beyond. I think they've looked at the top 20 mission system consulting companies and the top 10 value-added resellers. But how far down are they going to go, and what do those contracts look like, and how fast can they get them implemented? And are the OEMs actually willing to be prime contractors, or are they, can you rewrite the FAR in such a way that you assuage any concerns they have over liabilities of being a prime? There was an event at George Mason earlier this week at the Baroni Center where Larry Hale, who's the acting assistant commissioner for the IT category at GSA, suggested we're going to see the VARs and the OEMs sort of flip, perhaps, where the VARs will become subcontractors to the OEMs, as opposed to the OEMs subcontracting to the VARs. It's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out.
Now, Emily, you had some experience at GSA. That's your background. Tell us a little bit about your background and where you come from.
So I've been in the government contracting space for about 30 years. Got started because right out of college, I went to work for my hometown congressman, who was chairman of the Committee on Small Business in the House of Representatives. And I was the junior staffer. Junior staffer gets assigned to the issues no one else wants to work on. And so I got government contracting, disaster lending, and telecommunications policy. Okay. So satellites and telecom. Okay. And I fell in love with government contracting. And I really liked it. Saw that it was a place where you could actually get something done and you could make a difference. You could build a healthier industrial base. You could help agencies respond faster. You could save money. So I ended up going to law school, became a government contracts lawyer, and then went to the Small Business Administration in the Bush administration, ran their government contracting and business development shop for a while, and then went over to GSA and was their chief acquisition officer for the first one, the full-time chief acquisition officer they ever had. Again, this is Bush administration. Left, went to the private sector, and ran operations for a government contracting startup. Before going back to the Hill and working on government contracting policy again, and so doing a lot more of the legislation. And then in 2017, I went back to GSA and was nominated and confirmed as the GSA administrator, and stayed there through January of 21. So I spent 4 years at GSA then.
Wow.
So I think I've got 7 years in the executive branch and 9 years on the Hill.
Wow. And now what are you doing?
Now I split my time. I've got a consulting company that I run called Government Procurement Strategies. It's federalgps.com. And I do research on government contracting out at the Baroni Center at George Mason. So I write white papers on government contracting topics.
Oh, wow. Nice. Okay. Well, it sounds like you're busy.
I'm busy. I really appreciate that Baroni lets me write on topics that I find interesting. I did a paper last year on micro purchase thresholds that became surprisingly relevant today, since there's a whole discussion about what should the micro purchase threshold be, what should simplified acquisition thresholds be in terms of acquisition reform. So when you look at what's happening on the Hill right now, there's a lot of conversation about raising those. So it was one of the few research papers on what would you expect if you did this.
And what was the conclusion?
So the conclusion was that if you raise the micro purchase threshold, you would save a lot of contracting officer time. You'd be able to address a lot of common procurements a lot faster, and there would be substantial savings involved in it also. I think we said that even a $10,000 raise in the micro purchase threshold could save somewhere around $30 million, just because of the time and energy it takes to award those contracts, time at processing those orders, and that's not factoring in the fact you also get rebates when you do micro purchases if you're using the purchase card. So there's also money that comes back to the government that way. But you'd have to be careful about small business, because when you raise the micro purchase threshold, you're cutting into the small business reserves. So anything above the micro purchase threshold but below the simplified acquisition threshold is reserved for small business under Section 15 of the Small Business Act. So if you raise only the micro purchase threshold and not the simplified acquisition threshold, you sort of you shrink the small business. So then the question became, well, should you also raise the simplified acquisition threshold? And the proposals we've seen from the Hill seem to suggest and historically those two have gone hand in hand, so that small businesses end up actually with a larger small business reserve than they did before.
Okay, that's interesting. So if you raise simplified acquisition threshold, then they end up with a larger reserve.
Yes, because say the micro purchase threshold went from 15,000 to 25,000.
Okay.
And then the simplified acquisition threshold went from 250,000 to $500,000.
Okay.
The small business reserve goes from being 15,000 to 250, like that. So you've got about $235,000 in there to being 25,000 to whatever the new number is, and
Right.
so there are more dollars that would be covered by that small business reserve.
Wow.
And when you look at actual task orders that go to small businesses against the under that, they're only getting about half of those task orders right now anyway. So it might actually expand what what contracting officers look to small businesses to fulfill.
Right. Makes sense. Talk about now, again, there's a lot of things happening. You've helped startups, Fortune 500 companies. What advice are you giving now to BD leads trying to break into the space today, particularly in this particular environment?
Be very cautious about where you're going to go and what your business model is going to be. Because right now you're dealing with contracting officers who, there are far fewer of them, and they've got a lot of work they've got to get done. It's the 20th of June, so you've got, 102 days left in the fiscal year, I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of work that has to get done. So be very cautious in that fourth quarter, because we're under a CR. There was a lot that didn't get down to the program level as early as it has in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of workload. So you need to be very aware of the workload that the program office and the contracting office are working under. So be respectful of that, help them out, figure out an easy button for them, whether it's using GSA schedules, another GWAC, some sort of contract that makes it easier for them to reach you. It's wonderful to have the best product out there, but unless the contracting officer has a way to reach you, it becomes such a long process that it almost it can take away some of your competitive advantage.
Mm. I like that. That's a great way of putting it. Now let's talk about AI and AI oversight.
Okay.
There's growing momentum in Washington now about regulating AI, especially within procurement. GSA is reportedly developing centralized oversight policies for AI use. How should agencies, people, how should we think about that? What does that look like to us, to the regular person out here listening to all this stuff?
Right. So I think that one way to look at it is how the government's already regulating cloud when it's using it itself. So FedRAMP, the idea that would have a common set of authorizations. Mm-hmm. And if you look back at the AI memo that came out earlier this year from OMB, from the Federal CIO's office, it directed GSA to come up with a way of understanding what's out there in terms of AI, how it's being used, how often it's being used, and what's working, what's not, just trying to gather that data so that there can be a rational basis for it, but also being really aware of where you're using AI and how you're implementing it. So I think we're still very nascent in AI right now in the federal government. It feels like, so back in 2017, when I went back to GSA, everything was agile. Every time you blinked, right, someone told you that their procurement was an agile procurement. It was an agile IT solution. We're using AI a lot in the same way these days. So everything is AI, even whether it's robotics process automation, which isn't really AI, but maybe it is, or maybe it's full blown AI. Is it an LLM? So you have to be really careful what you're talking about. That said, I think that there's a strong belief that the workload that the government has could be better managed if they had the right AI tools, and in contracting in particular. And if you look at how GSA is already trying to implement it, they're using it for things like contractor responsibility to try and determine, take that work off of a contracting officer's plate so that they can get the results of it, analyze the results, and the letter's ready to go.
Right.
It'll be interesting to see how it could be used in terms of market research and trying to figure out what commercial solutions are out there, trying to do a better job of understanding past performance and what's been successful. So trying to get us on a results-based focus and trying to do it faster. Now, there's some concerns also, because you want to be careful that you're training your AI models correctly, right, that you're not inadvertently teaching them bad habits, or teaching it to draw conclusions it shouldn't, or reflecting reflecting the best knowledge we have today may not be the best knowledge we have next year or 2 years from now. So how do you make sure that it continues to learn and evolve with you? So, as they look at how to implement AI as a tool, and I think it could be a very powerful tool, there still are a lot of challenges that are involved in that.
Let me ask a different question. We talk about advocating for small business access to contracts, but we also were talking about expanding category management and consolidating contracts. Are those two areas in conflict?
Well, so they're talking about consolidating where contracts are awarded, not consolidating contracts necessarily.
Okay, consolidating where they're awarded. Okay.
So
That's a good.
The consolidation, I think, that at least that I've heard discussed, isn't a consolidation of it. I'll take it back. There's some where they're talking about, instead of having a dozen contracts for the same software, that instead we'll have one contract with the OEM itself.
Right. Okay.
So that would be a consolidation of, but it's going directly to the vendor. In which case, if there was a small who was reselling it, would that small business then become a subcontractor providing services? Because if they were an IT VAR, they would have been a substantial portion of the work would have been services already. So how are those services going to be delivered? So that it may be a flip there. I don't know that it's necessarily I wouldn't call it contract consolidation in terms of when you think about
I know what you're saying. I said not breaking them up. Yeah. But there has been talks in the past about category management impacting against small businesses.
And I always think that it depends on how you do your category management. If you look, for example, at various contracts that have been out there, some category management contracts have been bad for small business, and some have been very good for small business.
Okay.
I'll just throw out office supplies. If you look at the Office Supply One contract, that was the very first strategic sourcing contract GSA did on office supplies. Small businesses, it wasn't great for them. No one wanted to use the contract anyway. Office Supply 2, OS2, was a great contract for small businesses. You had small businesses winning prime contracts, but you also had small businesses who didn't, who could then come in and beat their prices. And a lot of the savings was delivered by those outside small business contracts. When they got to OS4, they actually even created special pools to have those small businesses, and make sure that you were able to reach them. So it all depends on the strategy you put into category management. If you think of category management itself as just, we want to understand what we're buying and who we're buying it from, and how we're getting the prices we want. So that we've got an actual deliberate strategy. That strategy can be, we want to use small businesses to buy this.
Okay. So for the people that are, if you have a magic wand, you can tell them what to do. You would say, okay, how will we structure it so that small businesses can benefit?
So, and that's where I think it's based on the data we have right now. There's no reason to panic, but there's also no reason to celebrate. So we don't know what this is going to look like.
Okay.
And it's going to depend on how but if you look at GSA schedules right now, GSA schedules, and if that's going to be the preferred method of contracting, they've been really good for small business.
Yeah. Well, again, I know a lot of small businesses that are on GSA schedules. I mean, there
are 14,000 companies on schedule. A substantial portion of them are small. I don't know the numbers. I used to know the numbers off the top of my head as to what percentage of dollars went to small businesses, but it was a substantial percentage of the dollars went to small businesses. And it was a wide variety of small businesses. It wasn't all the same small business getting the work again and again.
Right. So then why did they say that category management hurt small business? Why was that the theme that was going around? And again, not to this administration, previous administrations.
Well, again, it depends on how you implement it. So if your category management strategy is, we're going to reduce the number of contracts we have to do category management, in terms of, so category management means we're going to have one preferred contract with one preferred vendor to buy something. You're not going to have small businesses as prime contractors at that point in time. If your way of handling category management is to say, okay, we're going to this is our contract vehicle, and anyone who can meet the following levels can come in and play on this contract vehicle, then it can be very positive for small business. It just depends on how you set it up. And so I think sometimes category management's implemented in a way that's good for small business, and sometimes it's implemented in a way that's bad for small business. And so it's really the proof is in the pudding on that one, on like how well do they do it.
Right. That makes sense. So now fast forward to 2025, right? We discussed, we know they've been moving contracts around, right? So what are some of the other challenges that businesses in general are just facing from federal acquisition today?
It's with so much reorganization, it's hard. The pipeline's getting clogged. So I think that's part of the challenge that a lot of businesses are facing. For businesses, a yes or a no can be handled. It's the wait that costs money and they don't get anything done, and they can't make move on to the next decision. They can't continue to make the right strategic moves for those businesses. So it's completely understandable that a new administration comes in and wants to review the contracts it has to make sure that they are aligned with what that administration prioritizes. They're spending dollars in a way that makes sense for their objectives, that they think that they're getting the best deal. Throw on top of that, you've got an entity like DOJ coming in that really wants to find savings and drive those savings. So they're doing an additional level of review. And then GSA is doing its level of review. VA is doing its level of review. DHS is doing their level of review. HHS, every agency is doing their own level of review. At a time when you also then had the fork in the road, the deferred resignation program, and 1102s leaving. So you now have additional levels of review and fewer people to actually do the contracting. So the pipeline can, in some cases is getting clogged. In other cases, they've said, if DoD, for example, I think has said that if they don't have an answer back in a certain amount of time, then you move forward. So that a silence is a yes, essentially. But if you also then read what the administration's written in that FAR rewrite, the idea is that their goal is to ultimately speed things up and reduce the levels of review. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, that's interesting that you said. You want to speed it up, but then they have less people to do it. So that's interesting.
Again, it's why you need the right tools, AI, contract writing systems, making sure that they've got the support that they need to do that work quickly.
Where are some other promising? Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I didn't. What did you say?
I was saying, and making sure you've got the right contract vehicles.
Yes. Okay. Where are some other promising opportunities where you see reform?
So it's going to be really interesting to see what comes in the Part 12 rewrite of the FAR, because that's commercial item procurement. So there are a lot of clauses in there that have been applied to commercial item contracting that many believe don't need to be, that they really are more appropriate for Part 15 type contracting or for other types of contracts. So that's going to be an interesting area to see how much burden can be removed from contracting and where does the administration draw that line. So that could be an area for really speeding things up. We're also seeing additional use of CSOs, the Commercial Solutions openings, to buy commercial software, the use of OTAs, the other transactions authority, the consortiums. That was actually referenced in the president's executive order on defense contracting. So you're seeing a lot of push to speed that up. You're seeing a lot of push out of the Senate and the House, especially Senate Armed Services Committee end of last year introduced something called the Forged Act to look at defense procurement and how to speed up and sort of modernize defense procurement. It's gotten a lot of attention. I think there, in many ways, it's very aligned with what the administration was talking about doing as well. And does that happen just for the Department of Defense? Does that happen for defense and civilian agencies? Because if your goal is to have a more unified, simplified contracting system, you don't want defense having something that's too terribly different from the civilian agencies, because you lose your ability to have that contract, the consolidation of contract management or the awards, who's awarding the contracts. So those are some things that I'm watching and paying a lot of attention to. And again, how does CSO and OTA play out? How does the Small Business Innovation Research Program play in this also? Because it's an area that has produce some of the most interesting commercial technologies that we've seen in the last 40-something years. It's up for reauthorization, and it has to be reauthorized before September 30th. So is Congress going to get it done on time? Are they going to give it a short-term extension as part of the CR, which they've done sometimes? They don't always do. Is it going to lapse and then be reinstated, which is what happened a couple of years ago? But that leaves a lot of contracts and a lot of technology sort of in limbo. And so hopefully we won't see that this time.
I didn't know it had to be reauthorized.
September 30th.
So when was the last time they had to reauthorize it?
It was reauthorized 2 years ago. So
okay.
2023.
I did not know that. I
and it had it lapsed for several months at that point. So there could be, it meant that none of the phase ones were awarded. They actually pulled back agency announcements around it. And Department of Defense actually came back and said you can't do phase threes even.
Wow.
Yeah. So that things that had already gotten to commercialization got stopped.
I didn't know that. That's
wow.
Okay. You're teaching me a lot today.
I've been in this space for a long time.
Yeah, no, I know. But I mean, I've met a lot of people in this space a long time, and they kind of stayed in one lane, right? It seems like you've crossed a lot of different lanes, right? From just so many people been in just one lane, and they know that very, very well. So
the first time I worked on SBIR SBIR was 1997. So I think that was my first SBIR reauthorization that I got to work on.
Okay, all right.
And that's been that's 28 years now. So yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a while. No, that's interesting. So you've been on the regulator side, you've been on the strategist side. What is something that you wish more agency leaders understood about policies that affect vendors?
That affects vendors. When agencies get upset with the industrial base they have and they try to make changes in the industrial base, that the reason that the companies are structured the way they are is because that's how the regulators told them they needed to be structured. That no one sat around going, you know what I really hope to do someday is have a DCA approved accounting system and subcontracting system. And I want to create a bureaucracy around how long I have to keep these. There's no company out there that ever came up with this on their own. They structured themselves that way because the government asked them to. And so in order to meet the government's mission, they fit themselves in that box. And then there seems to be this idea that if we instead go after companies that aren't in that box, we can get something new and different. And yeah, you can get something. But you could also, if you took some of the restrictions off of these other companies, you might be able to get more things there as well. And if all we do is deregulate for companies that aren't currently doing business with us, we lose a lot of the experience and knowledge from the companies that have been a part of that industrial base for generations.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And vice versa, what should more contractors understand about how decisions get made in government?
That government's not a monolith, and that it does take a while for whatever decisions being made at the most senior levels to work its way down to that journeyman level contracting officer who's making that award or who's managing that contract. And that with all the change taking place right now, contracting officers are the ones who bear a lot of legal responsibility if things aren't done correctly. They're the ones whose warrants are at risk. They're the ones who face criminal charges, lose their jobs. So with this much change, contracting officers are going to want to be more cautious. And it's not that they are trying to be obstructionists. They're just trying to make sure that they understand the new process and that they're doing things the way that they're supposed to be doing it and maintaining their oath under the Constitution.
The clients that you serve, what are some of the type of the issues that they come to you with that people ask for your help?
So we don't do lobbying. We don't do, we don't represent companies to the government. It's really strategic. Like how do they want to approach the federal market? What are the considerations they should have in looking at it with all these changes? What's the best way to approach those changes, and how can they do so in a thoughtful way that gets the government the results they want, that delivers the mission on the mission that the government has. Are there better ways to deliver savings? Are there better ways to deliver process? Are there better things that they should be communicating? Are there ways that they could restructure something that makes it easier for the government to do business with them or to understand that value proposition?
Makes sense. And what's the best way to reach you?
Emily@federalgps.com.
All right. And we have you on LinkedIn, and we'll make sure we'll link to all of that as well, so people can have this recording. What else is something that I forgot to cover that maybe you could think about that is important for us to know?
We talked about the legislative changes that are pending. We've talked about the regulatory changes that are pending. We've talked about the workforce changes that are happening. We've talked a little bit about the reviews that are happening at the contractor level and the OneGov structure, the GSA consolidation. I guess the one thing to keep in mind right now is that there is so I wrote a paper years ago that looked at executive orders around government contracting and tracked how many there had been going back to the Clinton administration. So looking at it and how often they were used. And to say that the first 100 days, 120 days of the Trump administration that has blown through those records. And Biden blew through the records of the first Trump administration. So each administration is doing more and more in contracting. That's true from when you look at Clinton and to Bush and Bush to Obama. Each administration uses contracting to do more and more things. So it's just something to keep in mind that contracting can, if you've ever heard the better living through chemistry, we used to joke about better living through contracting. Because there seems to be an idea that contracting can solve all the world's ills if you just put the right clause in a contract. So that's one thing that everyone should be very cognizant of, the tension they're creating when they try to do things that aren't related to getting the best price, the best deal, the best solution, the best result in contracting, that it does have repercussions in that contract and in the system, and make sure that they understand how those fit together. So that's one thing that I wish people talked a little bit more about, that contracting cannot get you what you want and solve all the world's ills at the same time.
Right. Yeah.
And then we need to be a little more risk tolerant. The contracting system we have right now with protests, I don't mean to suggest that protests aren't a good thing, because they give the public confidence that the government's buying things in the right way. But when we become so risk averse that we're afraid of failing with a contract, we lose out on that cutting edge technology. We lose out on the commercial solutions, where it might cost us a little bit of money to try something and fail early, but we learn from that, and the next iteration is going to be better. Right. And we can deliver on it. And if we create a contracting workforce that's so afraid of a protest that they're afraid to try something creative, then we're not going to get the innovation in the system that we're looking for. And that comes from leadership. I mean, they've got to be willing to support that workforce.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I could think of two real life examples of people who wanted to suggest alternative options to the government that would save money and time and be more efficient, but they said, no, we're just going to do what they asked for, because we're not going to win a contract, and we're not, they're not going to listen to us, and no one's going to care, and they're just going to tell us to get the job done. So I could see that. Totally.
And if you think about it, it's only been a little over 10 years since Oasis Plus came up with that self-scoring scorecard concept, or Oasis, not Oasis Plus, the original Oasis award, where vendors had to score themselves as part of the evaluation process. I mean, that was a creative new approach, and it worked well. If someone had looked at it and said, okay, that could be manipulated and could be bad, it could have created risk, and it could have slowed things down. If you look at the problem we've had with GWACs recently and getting GWACs awarded, there have been delays in awarding CIOSP4, Sept 6, Polaris, Alliant 2 Small Business before that. And I can keep going, and I think we all know that there are a lot of them out there where we've had challenges. And it's not because there are bad actors on either side. It's because people were trying to do something and the protest, things got so bogged down that we never get to award, and that's also a problem.
Yeah. No, I have a friend of mine. He has a contract that was protested. He says it's been over a year now. He goes, at what point do we have to do the work? Like, at some point, the work still needs to be done, right? But it's been sitting in limbo in a protest for a year.
CIOSP4 has been in protest for over a year, and I think it has the most protests of any GWAC ever.
I was gonna say it actually. I think when I just finished having a conversation with this attorney law firm, and I think it literally raised the amount of GAO protests by like double just for that one GWAC.
It was a lot of protests, and I mean, but before we throw out GAO, remember that if it doesn't go to GAO, which at least decides protests in 100 days, it instead goes to the Court of Federal Claims.
Right.
That can take a lot longer.
Right.
And GAO, we've got some really expert attorneys who all they think about is government contracting, deciding cases. Whereas at Court of Federal Claims, they don't see. They see a lot of veterans claims. They see lots of other claims. I mean, so there are lots of other things they're looking at. They never get to develop, or not all the judges get to develop that same level of expertise or want to develop that same level of expertise around government contracting. But with a FAR rewrite, you're certainly going to see a lot more challenges as people try to figure out what the new bounds and the new rules are around government contracting.
Yeah. And when are we expecting the final rewrites? They have
I think that the deadline given by the president was that they had to have it done by mid-October.
Okay.
So we've seen, I think, 6 or 7 parts come out so far.
Well, let's get you back on in October after they do the FAR rewrites.
All right, that sounds great.
You can come back on and talk about all the new rewrites and what we should be looking at.
But don't wait till then though. If you're not looking at acquisition.gov at least once a week to figure out what the new FAR parts are, you're missing out because, as I said, some of them take effect at agencies pretty darn quickly. And you've only got a limited period of time to comment on them. The comment actually takes place through the acquisition.gov website. So you click on a link to each part and it lets you fill out a form and send in the comments. And don't just read the language, also read the supporting materials. Make sure that you're seeing everything that goes along with it. It's been done pretty well.
Okay, the page is now here. Okay.
Yeah. So if you click there,
revise
streamline FAR and agency deviations. If you click on that one, it will take you to, there's part 1, 10, 11, and then it should go to, emergency acquisitions, major systems, with IT, which we were talking about earlier, contract mods, and then the clauses.
Wow. Okay.
And then if you actually click through on any of those parts, like if you click through on part 10, go to part 10. One doesn't give you nearly as much because it's just principles. But if you go to part 10, and then you look over on the side of the page, there should be, you'll see the practitioner album down there.
Yes.
So to submit your feedback so you can put your comments in. And that practitioner album, which is excellent, gives you a lot of information on why the government did what it did and how it's training its workforce on how to use this.
Wow. Nice.
So they did a really nice job in explaining their thought process on that.
I appreciate that. I think that's definitely a change from what, the noise that people are hearing. I mean, this is, like you said, it's obviously very well organized and put together, and people can go through and read it and understand it.
And you can see what tools contracting officers are being told to use. And it also, frankly, creates a sort of a just-in-time training opportunity for contracting officers if they're looking at a problem and they need to go back and figure out, okay, I'm reading this language. It's not the language I'm used to. How am I supposed to interpret this? They've got those resources right there. And it also refers to the fact that it's going to have some additional resources coming soon. And that'll be great to see when those come out as well.
This is nice. I'm looking through it. This is, like you said, it's really well done.
They did a really nice job of it. And videos, some of them have case studies in them.
Right.
The part 11 actually, I think, has a case study in it and talks about, how thinking about how you're going to speed things up. How are you going to do it? How are you going to do everything?
Wow.
So just a lot of information in there, and that's really helpful.
I like it. Emily, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Good to be here,
Eric. You dropped a lot of information, lots of jewels for people to take back and practical steps. So I definitely thank you for that.
My pleasure.
And we'll make sure to share all your information on all our socials. and let people know where they can reach you at. So thank you so much,
Great.
Emily. I appreciate you coming on today.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Bye-bye.